I got stuck in a literature loop, and for the first time in over a decade, I'm thinking, maybe I want to get out. My reading journey has been quite a roller coaster, but all the ups and downs of that roller coaster happened before I was like 16, maybe 18 at the most. For the last 12 years or so, we've been on one of those in-between parts of the roller coaster where you're just kind of chugging along, waiting for something to happen. And it feels like it's time for me to put another plummet in there, or at least climb a hill. Something's gotta change, because in the last few years, I've noticed that my automatic pilot mode of reading only classic literature does not always result in a pleasant reading experience. And then I quite often don't want to read at all, or feel like I'm forcing myself to read instead of enjoying reading the way I so wildly enjoyed it when I was a kid. This is not true of every book. I first really became aware of this when I was reading Ulysses. I feel like I've talked about reading this book in so many videos now, but it did take up a major chunk of my life. I had tried 5 times to read Ulysses. I had gotten maybe a third of the way through on my last attempt, and I was absolutely determined to actually finish it this time. The problem is, I really did enjoy a specific chunk of this book. It just so happens that that specific chunk was the very, very beginning. After that, I didn't really like any of it. It was interesting in parts, the writing style was fascinating at times, but I'll be honest, I didn't really get the hype. Every time I heard that book described before actually reading the whole thing, it was like they were describing 1/10 of it at most, and completely forgetting that the rest of it existed. But I was absolutely determined, so I forced my way through it, and reading became a drudgery and a chore. However, upon finally finishing that brick, I read Edith Wharton's Custom of the Country, another classic. Didn't know anything about it except that I tend to like Wharton's writing style, and it took a minute. It took a couple of chapters for me to really get into the story, but then I did. All of a sudden, I wanted to read. I was looking forward to that time sitting in bed reading before I go to sleep, which is the only time that I read anymore because reading feels like such a luxury these days. That's a whole other thing. It was the easier choice again, easier than doom scrolling Instagram or playing a game on my phone, and that was delightful. When it comes to the classics, even if you have a preference for them like me, there are gonna be some books that you read and you're like, this is super dry and boring, and I don't quite get why it's lauded as a classic. And then others you'll completely love and get super into. You'll be entertained. Here's what I've read post-Ulysses and the briefest of my thoughts on them. Enjoyed it. I was moved. Way better than the movie. Short and apparently not so simple. Way better than the musical. What on earth? Very philosophical, but worth the slog. Funny if you've got a very specific sense of humor. But isn't that also the thing with all books? This isn't a problem confined to classic literature. I'm not losing my love of reading solely because I read the classics. I know this to be true because back in the earlier days of the roller coaster, I read modern fiction, and some of them were good, and some of them were bad, and then so many of them were bad that I stopped reading them altogether. If a classic is boring and unenjoyable, at least I can pretend to myself that I, accomplished a thing for reading it, right? I feel like that's where a tinge of snobbery comes in. Nowadays, reading anything feels like an achievement, though. Anyone else have the experience of becoming an adult and getting, busy? And reading being the first thing to go? It's unfortunate. I'm very grateful to have been raised in a home where reading was not only encouraged, but it was even prioritized. We had shelves of children's books that my parents would read to us at night from a very young age. Probably from infanthood, because there was always a younger sibling, My oldest sister would read chapter books to us at the lunch table, Cheaper by the Dozen, or we'd read Encyclopedia Brown and try to solve the mysteries together. Trips to the library were frequent, and every summer we took part in the summer reading program, and we would absolutely obliterate the prize box. With 7 kids, you can get a lot of books read. Every Christmas and birthday involved new books. We'd each have our own list of the ones we wanted, because the books in our home, with rare exception, didn't belong to the family as a whole. They were specific to each child, though obviously sharing was a given. It was cool to have the series or collections that were special to you, stored on your shelf and lent out to your siblings. My older brother had the whole Boxcar Children collection. One of my sisters had the Mandy series, and another one had all of the Anne of Green Gables books, and another one called Bonnets and Bugles. I don't know that I could say all 7 of us loved reading. Being different people, we all had different reading abilities, but I think all 7 of us had books that we loved. And reading, for me, not only was it an escape in the way that I think it's an escape for most people who read fiction. You know, the stories are an escape from everyday life. You can immerse yourself in them and live in this fantasy world for a bit. It wasn't just that for me. Reading was also a literal escape in reality. As an undiagnosed, neurodivergent, highly introverted child in a full household that did not prioritize privacy or alone time, reading was an actual literal way for me to get away from everyone else. It was an acceptable, or at least logical, reason for me to be alone in the girls' bedroom for hours. While everyone else was doing stuff in the living room, the kitchen, the office, I could be by myself, which I desperately needed. Even if I was in the living room with everyone, I could curl up in the corner of the couch with a book, and generally speaking, people will leave you alone because you're reading. So it was very much a physical escape for me from my family, which to some may sound kind of rude to say, but I think anyone who grew up constantly very overwhelmed by their physical surroundings and unable to verbalize that to anyone or fix it in any way. Anyone who did not have the power as a child to take care of their needs in the way they wanted to because it simply wasn't allowed for them will probably get exactly what I'm saying. It's not an offense to my family. I simply needed alone time as a child, and reading was often the only way I could get it.
Reading on the toilet? Even better.
It literally got to the point where my mom would threaten to ground me from reading. I was always so confused when kids would say I'm grounded because I'd be like, from what? And they'd be like, what do you mean from what? I'm just grounded. I assume for average kids, being grounded meant that you weren't allowed to like go out with friends or something. For us, being grounded was always from a specific thing, usually either TV or the computer, which were already highly regulated anyway. You couldn't ground us from going out because the only places we went were like church and dance class. But my mom very much did not like her children to have privacy or alone time, which is a whole other thing that affected me in so many ways. We shan't get into it too much here. She didn't like if you hadn't passed through her line of vision in a while, or if she felt like you weren't participating in family time. And I was quite often, very purposely, guilty of that because I was trying to stay sane and stable. So she would come find me in my room after hours of absence, curled up in a chair reading a book, and she would threaten to ground me from reading if I didn't spend time with the family. I don't remember her ever following through on it, but then I also probably just did as I was told and spent time with the family. There are a few books and series that really meant a lot to me when I was young, a lot of which I think we got from the library, actually. I recall this one series about 2 young girls who were best friends and got into shenanigans together. I appreciated it because unlike most of the books inside our house, it wasn't put out by a Christian author and/or publishing company. So it managed to be a delightful and wholesome series of stories for a young reader without a sermon stuck in the middle or a moral preached at the end. Lovely. One of the first books that is burned into my memory because it was so special to me, although apparently not special enough for me to remember the title, was this fantasy story about a young princess. It might have just been called The Princess. This was early chapter books. You know, when you've got chapters now because you're a big kid, but there's still some illustrations throughout, and the book is so thin that it'll slide behind the dresser and get lost forever if you're not careful. It was so good, I'm surprised it didn't disintegrate in my hands from how much I read it. I don't remember what the whole story was about, other than like a young princess having to take on new responsibilities. I think she was in danger and had to go into hiding. It might have been that old, the king is dead and you're our next leader, we better hide you kind of trope. Pretty grown-up concepts for such a young reading age. And there's a specific scene I still remember where she's basically presented with the dilemma of two options. You could do this or you could do this. I believe in the context of like, for your kingdom and people. And there are pros and cons to each option, and neither is totally right or totally wrong, and someone's going to be upset no matter which one you choose. So being a leader is about making hard choices, and you can't please everyone. Right? Pretty grown-up concepts for a book thinner than a Ritz cracker. I was probably like 6 years old reading that story, and that right there is why I loved it so much. It didn't talk down to me. I couldn't stand it when books talked down to me, and so many children's books did. Especially, let's be honest, the ones that felt the need to include a sermon or a message or a moral. Specifically, I remember this series. I think they were just called the Alex books. I didn't really love them in general. They were pretty preachy and I didn't relate at all to the main character. But there was this one specific book in the series, Peach Pit Promises. I mean, clearly it left a mark because I still remember the title. 'Twas the most preachy of them all. There was like full-on sermon, just smack in the middle of the book. And y'all, sometimes you just want to read a story and be entertained, you know? My great relief from religiously themed books was American Girl. My oldest sister was largely responsible for the infiltration of American Girl books and products in our home, because honestly, we could not afford them. Those dolls were expensive, even back then. With 7 kids, though, there's quite a gap between the youngers and the olders, so I was still pretty young when my oldest siblings were getting their first jobs. An American Girl entered our home via my oldest sister, who got my younger sister and I both dolls when we turned 10. I am so grateful for the many books that company produced over the years, and to my sister for making them available to me from a young age. These are not the originals from my childhood. I actually found these at an estate sale a while back, and I snatched those up so fast and got them super cheap. I mean, ultimately, my issue with the Christian books isn't just the sermon stuck in the middle. Not all of them did that so blatantly. It's that the stories were usually kind of watered down and safe. They didn't exactly love to explore complex issues, and they were always going to be religiously biased. American Girl books, on the other hand, they went pretty hard. I keep seeing these reels on Instagram poking fun at how depressing American Girl stories were, but like, that's why I loved them. They did not shy away from portraying hardship and death and trauma. Some of their stories were straight up heartbreaking. I still have their Girls of Many Lands series, which were written for a slightly older reading age than like the main stories that they put out. But y'all, like, they went hard. In the French one, something like 16 people die of plague before the end. It's fabulous. I sobbed. Perfection. That series also blessed me with the first storyline that I felt naughty for reading. The first book that I was like, oh, don't tell mother about that one. Get your minds out of the gutters. We haven't even moved to romance novel territory yet. This story portrayed Christian missionaries from the perspective of the Native American tribe they had come to convert. I had never read anything so marvelously unbiased by religion. It was delightful. And also I felt so guilty. Another beautiful break from religiously themed fiction came when a family friend handed me their daughter's copy of Ella Enchanted, which I've never returned. My mom trusted that it was appropriate because she trusted their parenting, and I dove into a story that still moves me to this day, possibly because of nostalgia, but also a girl being forced to do things she didn't want to do because of a curse. I related. And then I got to acquire a few other Gail Carson Levine books because she had been deemed safe, and it was a beautiful little oasis for me. By the time I was 10 or 11, I had already run out of books. Seriously, like I was completely out. I had read every book in our house that I was allowed to read, most of them dozens of times each. I had brought home every book from the library that my mom deemed safe for our restrictions. I had been devouring books faster than a raging fire, and I needed more fuel. So we tapped into the romance novel category. The Christian romance novel category, which was the only type of romance novel that was allowed in our house. 2 of my older sisters were also hardcore into reading, and they had amassed quite a collection of Christian romance novels by this point, which they began to scour through, looking for the most tame, the most clean, the most unromantic romances. I was 10 after all. There was this specific author, Jeanette Oke, quite prolific, very clean. Lots of historical fiction that took place out west in the small towns on the prairies of America where school teachers fell in love with farmers and no one so much as kissed on the lips until a proper ceremony had taken place. Honestly, I do not remember a single storyline, and I don't mean this to be like a general criticism of the author or her work. I can completely understand why a lot of people would love that kind of story. I think the words cozy and comfortable could be applied to them. But after about 24 had passed through my hands, I was hungry for something else. Anything else, please. I didn't know what was out there in the world of literature because most things in our family were just passed down from the older kids. It was hard to discover something for yourself. It was hard to know what I actually wanted because my key to existence back then was mimicry. I observed, I learned, I agreed, I copied. So my sisters continued to funnel more romance novels into my hands, and while there were a few that I genuinely enjoyed, and literally just one that I've kept in my current collection, possibly because I really liked the title, I'm not sure. It didn't take long before I was reading chapter 1 and skipping straight to the end. Oh look, they get together, they get married, they live happily ever after, whee! The romance category wasn't doing it for me. Gee, I wonder why. The religious theming didn't help. I didn't know it, but I desperately wanted adventure in my stories, and I wildly did not care about love and marriage. Then one day, one of my sisters, who now worked at a Christian bookstore, brought home a paperback with the word free scribbled in Sharpie across the image of a blue dragon on the cover. It was under a table at work. They said she could take it home. It was a teen fantasy novel, and guess who was a teen? Almost a teen. Close enough. The book was mine. I was thrilled. Turned out it was the second book in a series called The Dragon Keeper Chronicles, and it was everything I didn't know I wanted. Adventure and mythical creatures and magic and a young heroine struggling with her place in the world as she faces new responsibilities and has to make hard choices. Almost like that princess book I adored years and years before. How had I not known that Christian fantasy was an option, that it was even a thing? I had been writing stories since I was like 8 years old, but I credit this series with being the real true inspiration for me to write stories and not just like stories. I consumed the whole thing, went back to book 1, blazed my way through the series, and then began to read every Christian fantasy book out there. There weren't as many back then as I'm sure there are now. And while none of them ever connected with me as much as that first series had, they were a delightful breath of fresh air. First of all, because they were about teenagers, like me. The romance novels had to be about grown women because they had to end in marriage, or sometimes start with marriage. So many mail-order bride stories. So many. There was a disconnect there, especially when reading them at like 12 years old. The fantasy books sometimes had a romance that grew over time as the characters got older, but it was never the main focus, and sometimes there was no romance at all. There was always so much action and adventure and excitement, and best of all, because these stories took place in fantasy worlds, they weren't so blatantly obvious in their religious connections. And that was so relieving to me because y'all, once again, I just wanted to be entertained with a good story. But I was becoming more and more aware of the writing itself. The language, the craft, the skill behind the world building and the plot and the characters and the words used. The library of fiction allowed in our home was very limited, and I was once again getting restless. I had burned my way through the 2 shelves of teen fantasy at the Christian bookstore and was having to default to historical romance. Although, now that I was slightly older, there were some more interesting ones, like piratey, medieval. I was a sucker for a good Gilded Age story. But we were still back to love and marriage and grown-ups, and I was ready for the roller coaster to plummet. I feel like I am dumping a little on Christian fiction, and I don't want to sit here and say that all Christian books are not as well written. That's obviously not true. Although honestly, and like I really have trouble publicly criticizing people for their craft, so this is not easy for me to say. Honestly, I think there's less good quality stuff when you narrow it down specifically to a religious author or publishing house or just theme to the book in general. It's just how it's gonna go. There's a smaller category to start with, and you're putting restrictions on it. But there's another reason that I personally didn't connect as well to religiously themed fiction. I already spent a lot of time in my childhood at church, in Sunday school, doing Bible study, and here's a little insight into my thoughts that we don't have time to further develop right now. I was bored by it. I found it all exceptionally boring, even as a young kid. So then to have to read books that included sermons or religious subtext or very blatant Christian teachings was just very much like, oh my God, can I have a break from this, please? And on that note, I said earlier that reading was an escape for me, both in a literal and non-literal sense. And Christianity was such a constant, present part of my family life, of my existence within this unit that I did not always feel comfortable in, that I didn't really want to be reminded of it when I was trying to escape. It made the escape a little less escapey. So yeah, I just felt like I needed to explain that further because I don't want it to seem like I am insulting the abilities of all Christian authors or saying as a blanket statement that all Christian books are not as good. I did really enjoy some of them, but I just think for me personally, the religious theming, the constant presence of that in the book, made the books less good for me. I felt much more immersion and escape when I was reading American Girl books, or even when I was reading Christian fantasy, where the religious theming was presented in a much more subtle way. In retrospect, this feels like so much reading in my mind that I'm like, dang, this has to have been years, right? Like years and years and years going from romance to fantasy and kind of back to romance again. But I think I was only like 12 or 13 when my reading journey took another turn, which goes to show how much free time I had. I don't even consider myself that fast of a reader. I've known some fast readers, and that is not me. I was just homeschooled, and I had so much time to hide in my room with a book. Anyway, one day, my older brother pulled a mysterious series of books off the highest shelf in our living room, a shelf that I had been looking upon my entire childhood with mystified awe. This shelf had big books on it, chunky books without the title on the spine, leather-bound books, books that showed age, books with odd images on their covers or no images at all. They didn't look like the rest of the books we read. They were classics, my dad's books from when he was younger. The series my brother had selected was the Chronicles of Narnia. Now, it is probably confusing to some that in a Christian household, none of us had read the Chronicles of Narnia, a series well known for being heavily allegorical. But at this time, the newer Narnia series had not come out yet. In fact, I think it might have been the announcement of the production of the first one that had spurred my brother to read the series. I was 13 when The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe came out, so yeah, that checks out. I think the series as a whole just hadn't been in the public eye for a while, and since the only classics we knew about were like Little Women and Anne of Green Gables, which had beloved movie versions, no one in my family had an established view of this strange fantasy series. It's also possible that my mom, having not read the series herself, had issues with them due to the word witch being in the first title. She did not approve of witches. Guess what other popular series we were absolutely not allowed to read? But I was very competitive with my older brother, and if he was going to read these 7 books, you bet your britches I was gonna read them too, and finish them first for no necessary reason. I was immediately obsessed. There was an immediately noticeable difference in the way that the modern authors that I had read wrote and the way that these books had been written. And I don't even mean in the story itself. The writing had a different feeling. I have a whole theory about why, but we'll leave that for another day. Suffice it to say, something clicked. Here at last was the fantasy and adventure and magic and young characters that I loved, but all wrapped up in a really skilled, mature, developed use of language. The Chronicles of Narnia was my entry portal into the world of classic literature, and once again, in a whole new wonderful way, reading became the best frickin' thing in the universe to me. I looked upon the mysterious high-up shelf with brand new eyes. That giant leather-bound book was the entire Sherlock Holmes collection. Devoured. The red book with no title on the spine was a Rudyard Kipling collection ranging from The Jungle Book and Just So stories to Puck of Pook's Hill and Kim. Consumed. I recall the Iliad and Odyssey being up there too, but I did wait a few years before tucking into those. My brother had also been bit by the classics bug thanks to Narnia, so Barnes & Noble, Borders, half-price books, they all took on new meaning to us too. We were always saving up our allowances to buy chonky books. Books that would be chonky on their own, put into even chonkier collections. We remained competitive in the best way possible, but we also had a new interest to discuss. We were reading Robert Louis Stevenson and Alexander Dumas, Nathaniel Hawthorne, all of Tolkien, more of Lewis, Dickens in London, and O. Henry. I picked up a bunch of kids' classics that we had never experienced in written form. Peter Pan, Alice in Wonderland, Mary Poppins, Robin Hood, King Arthur. We had lists a mile long of all the books we were determined to read before we die. There are just so many classics that modern literature completely disappeared from view, and this is still, you may have noticed, with a very, very limited view of what the classics were. I mean, someone pointed out to me eventually that I had pretty much only read books by white men, and I was like, oh dang! That's unfortunate. Eventually I started specifically picking up classics by female authors at least. Austen, Bronte, Wharton, Woolf. Tried to get a little bit of diversity in there. But y'all, what we consider the classics over here is not super diverse. It wasn't until I started taking college courses my senior year of high school that I was introduced to slightly more varied classic literature. Like, still mostly written by white men, but a little more creative in style, you could say. I took a literature class, I believe covering 1850 to 1950, and was given a list of books from which I was supposed to select one to read and write a report on. A list of books that by time period status were classics. And I didn't recognize a single title. It was a bit of a wake-up call, although it mainly just served to extend my to-read list to absolutely insane lengths. I ended up selecting As I Lay Dying by Faulkner, and y'all, there is a whole chapter in that book that is just one line. My mother is a fish. This was no Dickens or Kipling or Stevenson. This was new stuff for me. And though I had now gone years without picking up a modern romance novel or even a modern fantasy story, there was another category of writing that I was consuming at massive rates while in college. Plays. I read plays because I'm a research person and I was a theater major, and I figured if I'm gonna do theater, if I'm gonna pursue theater, then I might as well really do it. So I'm gonna read every single play that I can get my hands on. Only there's a lot of them, so I just read as many as I could in the free time that I had, which is still quite a lot, hence the reason for my very large play library. I have a spreadsheet. Also, for everyone who's been asking what these rainbow books are, they're plays. This reading habit at least provided me with a bit more range, not only in time period, because I was reading everything from ancient Greek and Roman and Japanese and Indian plays all the way up to last year's Pulitzer Prize winner, but also range in terms of who the author was and what the stories were about. I think it was the jumping back and forth between play scripts, which are also typically pretty quick reads, and these massive chunks of classic literature that kept me uninterested in modern novels for so long. It provided a lot of balance to my reading habits. I could be in the middle of a chonky boy, feeling a bit dry and uninspired but determined to get to the end, and still take a break to read Equus, or Snow in Midsummer, or Gruesome Playground Injuries. But then I kind of gave up plays. Not entirely, I just read a few this year that were great, but I gave up reading stacks of them on a continuous basis. I guess because I'm not really in theater anymore. But also, I wanted to focus on novels, on classic literature. I wanted to knock some of those titles off of my insanely long read before you die list, which brings us up in the reading journey timeline to about a year ago. Plays are on the back burner, modern novels are still off the table entirely. I'm slogging my way through Ulysses for the 5th and I swear final time, and I realized one day that I don't like reading anymore. I don't want to read anymore. The few times that I pick up that brick before bed, it's with a sense of like, ugh, fine. Who wants to do something that's supposed to be entertaining if it's actually, ugh, fine? And I could just stop. I could say this is the end of my reading journey. I have other hobbies now. I have less free time. I could just let reading peter out of my life. But that's incredibly sad. Reading meant so much to me as a kid. That escape was so important to me. And in all fairness, part of that escape is no longer necessary, the literal part. I now have a safe space. I get to prioritize my privacy. I have my desired amount of alone time. So maybe I don't need reading anymore like I needed it back then, but I still don't want to lose it altogether. I think if you once loved reading and now you don't, it's likely due to what you're reading. So it is time for the roller coaster to drop. I need a plummet. I need a change. I think it's time for me to stop confining myself to the classics. I didn't intend to turn up my nose at modern literature, not at all. I simply found myself preferring the older writing styles, especially compared to my very limited experience with modern novels. And then suddenly I had a list a mile long. It kind of turned into, why read modern books when you haven't finished your classics list yet? You have limited time, you must prioritize. Ultimately though, I just want to enjoy reading again. I want to read, and I don't think the key to that is giving up classics altogether. I just think it's bringing some variety back into my reading habits. So I'd really like to read a modern book. Not necessarily one set in modern times, historical fiction is fine, but one that was written less than 50 years ago, possibly even less than 10 years ago. Shocking. I'm not picky yet, and I'd love your recommendations because I have no idea where to start. Even when I watch book reviews and such, there's nothing that stands out at me enough to be like, yes, that's it. That's the first modern novel I'll read in over a decade. There's too many options, there's so many different opinions, and I'd prefer not to read something just because it's been turned into a TV show or a movie, which seems to be the most in-your-face recommendations these days. So I'd love your opinions. No thrillers or horror or gore or anything like that. Not my thing at all. Mystery is fine though, as long as it's not overly graphic or meant to psychologically ruin you. Romance is great, I think. Again, my experience of it is extremely limited. But due to being asexual, my response to spicy physical intimacy is... it's not bad, it just doesn't, excite me. Emotional intimacy, on the other hand, yes please. Also, sci-fi or fantasy would be great too, just keeping in mind that, I'm wanting to try out modern novels, and a lot of those tend to be, big, long books and series with a lot of lore and world building, so probably best to start light-ish. But yeah, I'd love your recommendations for what modern novel I should read first after a 12+ year hiatus, and I will take whichever book is recommended the most in the comments, even if it's just mentioned twice, and I will go get it, and I will read it, and I will report back at some point. No pressure, but I'm really excited.
Where the frick is Austin?
Y'all, I have just become aware in the filming of this and searching for books that I apparently do not own any Jane Austen. I've read a bunch, but for some reason I don't own any. How did that even happen?
All right, y'all. For a week now, I have felt like I was losing it, puzzling over this no Jane Austen in my actual collection conundrum, because I swore I had some. And then I even started to remember that it was one of this type of book. It was in this series style, because I could remember the image that was on the front, and it was light blue down here, and I just thought that I was going insane. And then today I was editing the video and I was like, no, you have to solve this, and I dug through my entire collection of books, still couldn't find it, and then finally came to a realization. I put it in the guest room to make a little shrine to Jane Austen decoration area after coming back from England with Mr. Darcy here. That was only 2 months ago. I come in here all the time. Clearly my memory had no desire to hold on to that fact. But mystery solved! I do have Jane Austen. God, I thought I was losing it.
Are you gonna read books? Nah. That was a big yawn. Coffee. Why? Why yard work on a Sunday? Everything is fine. Good Lord. Come here. Hi. Oh, thank you. Look at all that fur. Look at all that fur going everywhere. My little baby butt. Bye. Oh, good Lord. Way better than the movie. Oh my God. Why is this arranged like this? I don't like that. Fur. Baby boy. Oh, I forgot there's lights in here. Wow. Back to the top. I'm done with all the talking. You can shower.